Hello and welcome back. This is the second lecture we're having on the U.S. Constitution. Today we're going to talk about Article 1, the powers of Congress. If you remember last time, we talked about the preamble and how the preamble articulated the definition of the American nation: popular sovereignty, rule of law, and tolerance. Today, we're going to get to the nuts and bolts into the structure of our government, and we're going to start with Article 1 of the Constitution, the powers of Congress. Again, page 9 of your textbook, the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of the Senate and the House of Representatives. We start with this idea of all legislative power. All legislative power belongs to a bicameral, a two-house legislative branch, which the first one is called the House of Representatives, and the second, the Senate. Now, in this class, we will talk interchangeably between Congress as a collective of these two and Congress as a nickname for the House of Representatives, depending on the context and that's being used. The House of Representatives is, again, is organized by population, and the Senate, every state has 2 senators. So we have senators from very populous states, such as California and New York, and we have senators from very almost empty states. Forgive me if you live in South Dakota or Alaska or Delaware, right? That we have, but they get 1 vote in the Senate. So we have 100 senators, and we have the House of Representatives that is organized by the population of the municipality. So California has many more members of the House of Representatives than, let's say, Wyoming. So this is basically, again, the first step in discussing the legislative powers of the Congress. Section 2. Section 2 talks in terms of what are the qualifications of a person and how can they become members of these 2 bodies. Section 2, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every 2nd year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and have been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. All right, so there we have starting to get some criteria. Number 1, for the House of Representatives, you have to be 25 years old. You have to be 25 years old. Well, wait a minute. I thought to vote you had to be 18, and to drink and to do these other things, 21, now 25? Well, again, remember back when in 1789, when the Founding Fathers wrote this document, right? The average age, the median age people were dying probably at 40. Of course, Ben Franklin was in the room and he was 80. That's like sitting today with the person who's 400 years old probably, right? But what did they want? They wanted people who were experienced life a little bit. Maybe you were working the land, maybe you had a family, maybe you had some military experience. They wanted people to have at least a maturity level. So it's 25 years old. What else did you have to do? What else did you have to be? Well, right, 7 years a citizen of the United States. You do not have to be born in the United States to serve in the House of Representatives. All you need to do is have been a citizen for 7 years. And finally, you have to live in the district. You have to live in the district not while you're campaigning, not while you're running for office, but on election day. On election day. When you are elected, you have to live in that district. Now, there might be some state laws and some other laws, but in the Constitution, those are the constitutional requirements to be a representative. This part of the Constitution has been amended, is no longer in effect, but people use it as an example of the injustice of our history. And again, yes, it's true. We don't hide the facts here of what's inconvenient or what might discount the American experience. We have slavery. We had slavery. And so the organization of how revenue is collected in the country and who counts and who doesn't count was articulated in this part of the Constitution. But let me repeat, this is not today part of our Constitution. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 all other persons. Again, this is the infamous 3/5 of other people. Well, and you may have read or you may have been exposed to some of the debate on the ratification of the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and you may know that this is really a means by which the South or the slaveholding states were trying to keep political control or representation in the Congress. I mean, a person who held slaves, they didn't on election day march their slaves into the polling booth and said, okay, we're going to numerically make sure that the 3/5 of your opinions are shared. This was a crass, if you want, a political grab for power, which ultimately ended in, as I said, in 1860, the American Civil War. We no longer have this, as I again said. We have basically one man, one vote, thanks to the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, but also all of the, which we'll get into later, the civil rights movement that started after the Civil War and spread through modern times. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States and within every subsequent of 10 years. You may be knowing that you have in the mail a census form. Again, 10 years. Every 10 years, we have a census. And that census gives us the distribution of representatives throughout the House of Representatives. So places, again, like China, they have not had a census. We really do not know how many people live in China. India has a really rough time trying to determine what's the census. How can you have a representative democracy if you don't know who lives in your community, if you don't know what the total number of people are who live in your country? The Founding Fathers knew this, and they have set the deadline. Every 10 years, we will take a census. In such manner as they shall by law direct. The numbers of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative until such enumeration shall be made. That formula has changed, but every small state has at least 1 member of the House of Representatives. When vacancies happen in the representation of any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of elections to fill such vacancies. Again, if you live in California, you know that there was a special election, I believe last week, for a member of the House of Representatives. So you have, right, a census every 10 years, and when a seat becomes vacant, there has to be a special election. Again, why are we going step by step, word from word for the Constitution? Because as I mentioned last time, These are the rules of the game. These are the reasons why we have a census. These are the reasons why we do different procedures and different steps in fulfilling the Constitution. So we have special elections when a member of the Congress, the House of Representatives, leaves that position. The House of Representatives shall choose their speaker and other officers and shall have the sole power of impeachment. All right, let's talk about the Speaker of the House and impeachment. If I can find my eraser. So, the members of the House of Representatives, they elect their leaders. The leader of the House of Representatives is called the Speaker of the House. And then you have the division between the different parties. We have in our country the Republicans and the Democratic parties. So you have whichever party is in the majority, they elect their majority leader. And then you have the minority leader. And then you have the majority whip. And the minority whip. And we will get in more detail when we talk about Congress, but basically this is what they call the leadership of the House of Representatives. Now, impeachment. We have had 3 presidents that have been impeached, and impeachment is not, as you may know, because you may be following the impeachment of President Trump, or you may have historically looked at the impeachment of President Clinton or the impeachment of President Johnson. But impeachment is an indictment. And some of you that may be familiar with law enforcement, an indictment is basically what would a reasonable person conclude, right? It basically talks in terms of how you've been there. Were you there? Can we not convict, but can we at least have a trial? Can we charge you with some kind of violation, some kind of malfeasance? And so we've had, again, 3 impeachments. President Johnson, Andrew Johnson after the Lincoln assassination, President Clinton, and now President Trump. President Nixon was not impeached. President Nixon was close to being impeached. The Judiciary Committee voted to send articles of impeachment to the floor, but Nixon was not impeached. Nixon resigned. We have never had a president convicted by the Senate. So impeachment is the indictment. Okay, is the indictment. Again, the presumption of innocence in our legal system is there, and that's why you have a trial. So the House of Representatives has the power of impeachment. That's section 2. That's the House of Representatives. We now move on to section 3, the U.S. Senate. Section 3, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. This is no longer accurate, right? This is no longer accurate because we have the popular election of senators, but we still have 2 senators per state. So when we have the Senate, in the U.S. Senate. So representatives, every 2 years we have an election. Their terms are for 2 years. In the Senate, their terms are for 6 years. 6 years. They're popularly elected, and you have 2 senators from each state. So Rhode Island, which is smaller than in geographic miles, I believe it's smaller than the county of San Bernardino, they have 2 senators. California has 2 senators. So this gives, again, a different type of flavor to the institution from the House of Representatives. And the next paragraph goes into how the senators are organized. Immediately after they shall be assembled in the consequence of the first election, they shall be divided equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of the senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the second year, the second class at the expiration of the 4th year, and the third class the expiration of the 6th year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every second year, and if vacancies happen by their resignation or otherwise during the recess of the legislature of any state, the executive thereof may make a temporary appointment until the next meeting of the legislature, which shall then fill such vacancies. So we have, and again, for our purposes, for the modern purpose, we wanted to have the Senate, 2/3 of the Senate, not up for re-election at any certain time. I seem to be having a problem with my eraser today. Okay, so we have, and think of it in terms of a pie shape. So we have senators running. So every 2 years we have elections, but we only have 1/3 of the Senate running in any particular election. Why did they want to do this? What were the founding fathers looking at? They were looking at the House of Representatives being the passion of the people, that every 2 years, again, elections instead of revolution. Every 2 years, you have people voting on their issues, voting on their passions, and have a quick turnaround. Everybody in the House of Representatives gets up for election every 2 years. The Senate, though, again, we have the act sort of as a governor on the engine of government. It slows things down. It's designed to have a situation in which there's some institutional memory. And the senators will say, well, wait a minute, right? Wait a minute. Let's think about this. Now, there's an old saying in government that says, basically, the senator's personality, they're people for about 4 years, and for 2 years, when they come in after election, and again, when they go up for re-election, they turn into politicians. Well, that's sort of the idea behind having only 1/3 of the senators up for re-election. Another difference between the House of Representatives, when we had special elections, and the Senate, remember, House of Representatives, if I don't want to be a congressman anymore, I'll resign, there's a special election. In the Senate, what happens is that in the Senate, you have the governor. The governor of the state will appoint the senator, the new senator, until the next election comes. So this happened in Georgia. Most recently, the governor appointed a new senator, and now that senator has to run for re-election. Some very interesting people have been appointed to the Senate, and what happens most of the time is they lose their election because they're just not popular enough. No person shall be a senator who shall not have attained the age of 30 years and been 9 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state for which he shall be chosen. Okay, so again, we have a difference than in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, you have to be 30 years old. You have to be 30 years old, and you have to be an inhabitant of the United States pardon me, you have to be an inhabitant of the state in which, when you are elected, you have to live in the state. Now, Hillary Clinton was the First Lady of Arkansas. She was the First Lady of the United States. And when she wanted to be a senator from New York, she moved to New York. She didn't have to move, again, to New York. After you are elected, then you have to move to the state in which you are elected. But she moved, and she was the senator from New York for about 10 years. The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. Okay, so this is, again, the Vice President traditionally has been a very minor job, but this is, again, in the Constitution, the Vice President is the President of the Senate. Is the President of the Senate and does not have a vote unless a tie. So this made Dick Cheney a very powerful vice president because the second term of the Bush administration, the Senate was about 50-50, so he had a lot of tie votes. We see Vice President Pence, again, more engaged because of the closeness of the voting in the Senate. We continue with the third article. Like the House of Representatives, the Senate shall choose their other officers and also a president pro tem in the absence of the vice president or when he shall exercise the office of the President of the United States. So again, in the Senate, there's no Speaker of the House. Instead, in the Senate, you have the organization by party, and you have the majority leader, who is Senator McConnell, and the minority leader, who is Senator Schumer. And then you have whips and other things. Traditionally, the majority leader was a weak position until Lyndon Johnson made it into a fairly powerful position before it became vice president under President Kennedy. The Senate shall choose their other officers and also President pro tem. Now, the succession to the White House was changed in amendments. You have the president, of course, the vice president, and then the Speaker of the House is the next person in line, is the third person in line, and then cabinet members by seniority of the department. So the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury would be the next two after the Speaker of the House. The Senator pro tem is also of that. So usually it's the oldest senator, and that person is more honorific. The Senate shall have the power to try all impeachments. All right, so again, under President Trump's impeachment, we know that the impeachment, the House of Representatives indicts the president, and then the president goes to trial. The senators serve as the jury, and the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court serves as the judge. Again, why do we have this? It's because it's written in the Constitution, and these constitutional principles are followed step by step. When sitting for that purpose, they shall be of oath or affirmation. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. So again, with President Trump, you had all the Republicans, except for Senator Romney, vote for acquittal, and you had all the Democrats vote for conviction. But it wasn't enough, right? You need 2/3. You need 2/3. Again, why? because the Senate is the organization or is the body that is not supposed to be as passionate as the House of Representatives. The next paragraph, judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to the removal from office and disqualification to hold any and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, punishment according to law. So again, all impeachment does is remove the person from office. Now you can have impeachment of presidents, but you can also have impeachment of secretaries of the cabinet or of federal judges. But impeachment, all it does is remove that person from office. So again, President Nixon was not impeached. But if he would have been impeached, he would have been removed from office, and then the crimes that we know that President Nixon engaged in, he would have been liable for. President Clinton was impeached. He was not convicted, meaning that he did not and was not removed from office. But President Clinton, after he left office, was charged and pled guilty to lying to a federal officer, perjury. And so President Clinton was punished. He was punished by being disbarred. He was also punished in a fine. And so the regular laws were enforced after President Clinton left office. President Trump was impeached. President Trump, again, was acquitted. But if those charges, or if that indictment includes the violation of federal law, then President Trump, once he leaves office, would be liable or would face any type of charges that he may have incurred. Again, I have no idea. I'm not commenting on the impeachment of President Trump. I'm not. That's politics. I have no information outside the public knowledge on this, and I'm not presuming any type of charges would be brought to the president after he left office. We're just talking about how we apply this paragraph in the Constitution. That's impeachment. Section 4. The times, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the place of choosing senators. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall be on the first Monday in December, unless they shall by law appoint a different day. They have changed that date through the amendment process, but again, we see this debate happening in current affairs today. This idea in the era of COVID-19 of all mail voting, right? Mail, M-A-I-L, voting. There's a huge debate between the Republicans and the Democrats about the availability of that. The state legislatures are the ones that determine local election and local election law. And again, if you think back to the year 2000 election with President Bush versus Gore, you had the local legislature, the Florida legislature, making laws and making rules that proved to be very confusing to both the Republicans and Democratic voters. We'll get into that later in the class. That's section 4. Section 5. Each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business, but a smaller number may adjourn from day to day and may be authorized to compel the attendance of absent members in such manner and under such penalties as each house may provide. Each house may determine the rules for its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3 expel a member. Each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish the same, excepting the parts of which may in their judgment require secrecy, and the yeas and nays of the members of either house on any question shall, at the desire of 1/5 of those present, be entered on the journal. So again, what is this part of the Constitution? It puts on record you're a member of Congress. It puts on record how they voted. And I think it's so funny when you hear people talking in terms of who they're going to vote for. Again, during the, if you have a critical debate, if you have a critical issue, such as the war in Iraq or let's say aid to the COVID-19 unemployed, how did your representative vote? And it's right there, it's published. What is your member's record? Right? Of course, most Americans do not vote this way, right? Most Americans vote on, I like the guy. He's handsome. She's pretty. Hair. Do I want to have a cup of coffee with this person? That's how most Americans vote. Instead of if abortion is an important issue to you, or the federal budget is an important issue to you, or the draft or defense or whatever is an important issue to you, how does your member vote? Look it up. That's all you need to do. Look it up. And that's why it's a huge challenge for senators to become president, because President Obama was the first senator since John Kennedy to be elected as a president, because their opposition research and politics will go through and say, where did this person vote? How did this person vote? And so again, 29, 30 years of being a senator for Vice President Biden is going to provide a lot of ammunition for the Trump administration in this election. While when President Trump ran, right, there was no record. There was no yeas and nays that his opposition could look into. Section 6. The senators and representatives shall receive a compensation for their services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. So a senator, right, a senator or a House member, they get paid approximately $172,000 a year. Now, one might think that's a lot of money. And probably if you're watching this video, or if you're in this room and this where I am today, it is a lot of money. It's a lot of money to me, and it's a lot of money to you. But let's consider this idea of what are the duties of a person who's a member of the legislature. You have to have two houses, right? You have to live in your district or in your state, and you have to live in Washington, D.C. So there are stories about members of the House of Representatives or senators who live in their office because, matter of fact, it's a very expensive job. Now, the philosophical question is, do we want to have only wealthy people as members of the legislative branch? Personally, I do not. Personally, I would like to have people who are of average means, people who, we need plumbers in the House of Representatives. We need people who are healthcare workers. We need policemen and teachers, and we just don't need very wealthy, only wealthy people. Wealthy people should be represented too, but we need a mix. We need to, ideally, it would be great to have members of the House of Representatives and the Senate who are a cross-section, not only of diversity, but also of experience. So how do we do this, right? That's why when you hear people like Ralph Nader or others complaining about the salary of Congress every time Congress votes itself a pay raise, I sort of hesitate, because I personally, this is a personal opinion, but I would like to see people who are of average means elected and serve in the House of Representatives or the Senate. So, but it comes from the Treasury, and you cannot have other work. In the British system, if you're a member of the legislature, then you can become prime minister, or you can become a ministerial cabinet. But in our system, the legislative branch is separate from the executive branch. They shall, talking about the legislature, they shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses, and in going to and returning from the same. And for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place. This is called congressional immunity. If I'm a member of Congress, this is called congressional immunity. If I say something, if I'm a member of Congress, on the floor of the legislative building that I am a member of, I am immune. You cannot sue me for libel. You cannot sue me for damages. If I'm on my way to the legislature or back to the legislature, I also share and enjoy congressional immunity. No senator or representative shall, during the time for which he has elected, been appointed to any civil office under the authority of the United States, which shall have been created, or of the emoluments whereof shall have been increased during such time, and no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either the House during the continuance of office. So again, when we have a new president come and the president wants to appoint a member of Congress, they have to give up their seat. They cannot be a member of the legislature and then be a member of the executive branch. So in the Trump administration, Attorney General Sessions was a senator from Alabama, and he had to resign his seat in order to become Attorney General. He did that, and then he was fired or resigned from the executive branch of Attorney General and ran again for the Senate, and now he is the senator from Alabama once again. Section 7 is very, very important. You will be asked about it on the exam. Section 7 of this first article is how a bill becomes a law, and it is a very, very important bill. A section of the Constitution. Section 7. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments on other bills. Okay, so when we're talking about money, when we're talking about revenue, we start with the House of Representatives. All bills of revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, and the Senate can advise, right? The Senate can then concur or advise when they get their chance. So when you hear people talk about President Trump's budget, or you hear people talking about how they disagree with the executive branch's way of spending resources, Congress is the one. The House of Representatives are the ones who can originate and who ultimately have the power of the purse, have the power to spend money. Every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approve, he shall sign it. But if not, he shall return it with his objections to that House in which he shall have originated, who shall enter the objections at large on their journal and proceeded to reconsider it. If after such reconsideration 2/3 of that House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent, together with the objections, to the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered. And if approved by the 2/3 of that House, it shall become a law. But in all such cases, the votes of both the House shall be determined by the yeas and nays, and the names of the persons voting for and against the bill shall be entered on the journal of each House, respectively. If any bill shall be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays accepted, and after it shall have been presented to him, it shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress by their adjournment prevent its return, in which case it shall not be a law. Every order, resolution, or vote to which the concurrence of the Senate and the House of Representatives may be necessary, except on a question of adjournment, shall be presented to the President of the United States, and before the same shall take effect, shall be approved by him, or being disapproved by him, shall be repassed from 2/3 of the Senate and the House of Representatives according to the rules and limitations prescribed in a case of a bill. Now, this might sound a little complicated. It might be a little hesitant with the legal language. And again, my objective in reading the Constitution is to not have you be intimidated by legal documents or by the original text. So let's go through this a step at a time. So again, we have the House of Representatives, we have the Senate, and we have the President of the United States. So I have a bill, and I write a bill, and I want this to become law. What do I need to do? Let's say I'm a member of the House of Representatives. And this is a simplistic structure, and we'll talk again with greater detail later in the course. But the Constitution basically says this is how we make laws. So think in terms of a majority in the Senate, the president signs it, and it's a law. We all know that. We all think in those kind of terms. We know that from grade school. Easy, right? What if the president doesn't sign it? And we have a veto, right? When the president does not sign a bill, it's called a veto. And he sends it back to the legislative branch, to the president and to the Senate. Now, what do? Well, let's say they really want this bill to be a law. It's really important to them. They want to make this a law. Well, they can. They can do it. All you need is two-thirds in the House of Representatives and 2/3 in the Senate, and it becomes a law. So again, when you have people complaining about whoever is in the White House, and you have people complaining about that person who's in the president, and we're making this tape as President Trump's in the White House, or when President Obama was in the White House, and people say, oh, the president, and if you look at the media, the press is overwhelmingly centered on the executive branch. But if you really want to know where the power is in our society, and when you hear these Congress people saying, well, I don't know, it's the president. No, right? No, you don't even need the president. You don't need the president to have a law at all. All you can do is if you can convince 2/3 of your body, 2/3 of the other members of the club to vote for that law, it can become a law. So again, it's very, very phony when you hear these members of Congress blaming everything on the White House. They have the power. If they want to spend $5 trillion on whatever, they can do it. All they need to do is convince 2/3 of the population, 2/3 of the population of their club, of their membership. That's all they have to do. So again, the question is, if you remember back 2 years ago in 2018, did President Trump win that election or lose that election? And people were saying, well, he lost it. He lost that election. Maybe, maybe not. If you think, and if you remember that 2/3 is sort of the magic number, and if the Democrats would have taken over the Senate, right, then President Trump would have lost that election. But because, first of all, President Trump wasn't running for election, and secondly, because the Senate retained its control, the Republicans still controlled the Senate, one could contend that President Trump actually won the 2018 election. And the direction of politics in our society, because people don't understand, let's say, or because they haven't read the Constitution, they keep on concentrating on the presidency. But it is Congress. It is Congress that has a lot of power. It is Congress who really determines our laws, right, through this process. Majority, presidential sign, president vetoes, 2/3, 2/3. If you'd want it, and again, whatever issue is important to you, you want to end the restriction on immigration. You want to have our society mandate solar power. You want to have a dedicated or negative income tax, meaning that everybody gets a certain amount of money every month. You want to have universal health care. You want to have any of these issues. You can have them without the executive branch. All you need to have is 2/3, 2/3. That's how a bill becomes a law, and that's why Section 7 of the Constitution, the first article, is so important. It's the keys to the kingdom. It's the element of power in our society. If you want to have an issue going from a political controversy to a legal controversy, all you need is Article 7. So what are the powers and what are the limits of power of Congress? That's in the next section, Section 8. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So when someone says to you, oh, that is an illegitimate tax, they're wrong. Okay, they're basically wrong. Because Congress has the power to tax us and to tax any element that they determine or that they deem, to tax any element as long as they follow two conditions. The first condition is they follow, as we just talked about, Section 7, how a bill becomes law, and that there is equal enforcement of that tax throughout the country. Now you may say to me, you might ask a question about, well, wait a minute. A lot of these industries are leaving California because the states are giving tax breaks to these companies. Well, again, that is state, right? That is California law or Texas law or Wisconsin law, but that is not federal law. Under the federal jurisdiction, it has to have the equal enforcement, meaning that if you live, equal enforcement. If you live in California and if you live in Rhode Island, you have to pay the same income tax determined on a universal criteria. So again, going back to current events, if you look at the COVID, the relief efforts for the people who have been unemployed for COVID and the money that was passed along, Congress has a real issue with people who make $100,000 a year. Well, maybe in Texas or Arkansas or Kansas or another state, people that make $100,000 a year are considered wealthy. So when Congress made the law, passed the law to give people relief from COVID-19, and they made basically $100,000 to $120,000 the cutoff, that might have been fine for people in the middle of the country or people from maybe more rural states. However, in California, as we know, that $100,000 a year is basically a teacher, a nurse, a policeman, or a fireman. So yes, those public employees and yes, those people do have jobs, but if you're talking about relief from the effects of the economic effects of COVID-19, this is, again, sort of an arbitrary number. But this is what happens when you have the universal enforcement of taxes and excises done by Congress. So Section 8 is known as the express and implied powers of Congress. And again, as we move through this section, I hope you're realizing how powerful Congress really is. And the focus, when we're talking about the Constitution, the founding fathers were very comfortable in giving Congress powers because they are not comfortable giving the executive branch, the president, a lot of power. Because remember, they rebelled against the King of England. So we have this tilt, or this emphasis on congressional power. So again, as I repeat, Congress has the right and the power to tax us. They also, to borrow, again, I'm on page 12 in our text, to borrow the money on credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and in the Indian tribes. I don't mean to be redundant, but see, Congress has passed along a lot of these powers to the executive branch. I may have told you recently that I spent a little time in the State Department in Washington, D.C., and I was in a meeting of the negotiations of the free trade agreement between the British and the Americans. Well, that was on the executive branch side. But Congress, and you hear people talking about, or you hear people complaining about President Trump's trade policies, or President Trump's policies when it comes to the economic powers of the government. Well, Congress has that power. The Speaker of the House and Congress, if they wanted to, they could interject, and they have the power to regulate commerce among foreign nations. But again, in modern times, they have handed that power over to the executive branch. They could take it right back. They could take it back. They just don't want to do that. Also, the next sentence, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, immigration. Congress, instead of complaining about or saying things about President Trump, he's a racist, this and that and the other, they could pass a law that could incorporate reform of the legal and naturalization process. It's an express power. Who do we look at when we want to have a discussion on immigration? It's not the president. It is Congress's responsibility, according to the Constitution. Also, rules of subject to bankruptcy. To coin money, regulate the value thereof in foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Bitcoin, or the development of these currencies that are based on technology. Again, it is Congress's role to determine if that is going to be accepted as currency. There's a great debate right now in international economics and international trade of the establishment of a I dollar, or of the Chinese developing an I BitChain type currency. But ultimately, it is Congress's power to determine that. To establish post offices and post roads. So the post office and post roads, again, is an express power of Congress. Now, this is again one of the things that makes this document so unique. And the next sentence, the next express power. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and to the inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. This is patent and trademark law. Now again, one of the things that we must remember is that the Founding Fathers were inventors. The Founding Fathers, as I said before, were products of the Enlightenment, and they believed in scientific inquiry. Ben Franklin was famous for inventing. He invented the Franklin stove, he invented glasses, and he invented the lightning rod. He also invented the first fire departments. So as a lightning rod, if you've lived in the country, you know this, but a lightning rod basically is it strikes a rod, and then the electrical charge goes and is grounded. And Franklin discovered this. Franklin said that I'm going to invent this, I'm going to give a patent of it, and I'm going to give it free. Franklin never accepted royalties for the lightning rod, and he said that that was his gift to humanity. Well, fast forward to today, and we have an incredible challenge with the People's Republic of China and intellectual property. And people don't believe that trademark and patents should be honored, right? So I download music and the author or the artist does not get paid. They own, presuming they didn't sell the patent, they wrote the song, they own it. And in our society, in our Constitution, we guarantee that that intellectual property is owned by the person who made that discovery. Now, under the rules of the divine right of kings, and in most other countries, that protection does not exist. This is, again, the protection of private property. If I invent something, I get the fruits of it. If you invent something, you get the fruits of it. Now, I think this is amazing, and I think that this part of the Constitution is so revolutionary and so has such far-sighted economic and intellectual consequences. To think that in 1789, the technology or the pollution that they were worried about was horse pollution. Or in 1789, the greatest medical innovation was bleeding someone, right? You put a leech on their wounds, and that was the latest discovery of medicine technology. Yet again, this is aspirational. We want to have a republic that is populated by people who are curious, that's populated by people who discover things, that people are inquiring on the nature of the universe, the nature of the world. Again, let me repeat that. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. And there are three. There are three levels of our federal courts. Again, we'll get into that much more detail in the next chapters of the course. But basically, there's the district court, the Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning the captures on land and water. Again, the Congress has not declared war since World War II, and we have a real problem with this because it's another example of Congress giving the power to the executive branch and then turning around because they don't want the responsibility. They don't want the responsibility of a vote. They don't want the yeas and nays. So when people in the 2008 election, when you had Senator Hillary Clinton running against Senator Barack Obama, and people were saying, I'm supporting Hillary because she's against the war in Iraq, that's ridiculous. She voted for the war in Iraq. So in Vietnam, you had senators and congressmen who never voted to declare war. Why? Because they did not want to have the political responsibility of the ramifications of that war. And the same is true in the first Gulf War. One of the things that, one of the real situations that we have is that Congress, although they have the constitutional power, they hand it off because they don't want the constitutional, or they don't want the responsibility, the political responsibility. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be longer for the term of 2 years. So again, we have defense appropriations, we have the budget of the military runs on a 2-year cycle because the Constitution demands it. To provide and maintain a navy. To make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. To provide for the calling forth of the militia. The militia is the National Guard. It is not what some of these guys are talking about, right? The militia is the formal National Guard, that the governors are the commanders-in-chief of those guards. To execute the laws of the Union and suppress insurrections and repel invasions. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such parts of them as may be employed by the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. To exercise exclusion legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, not exceeding 10 miles square, as made by cessation of particular states, and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise the like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which same shall not be erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. This is, again, Washington, D.C. Those are the express powers. Those are the powers that we can look to and say, Congress, the Senate and House of Representatives, has the constitutional authority to make those decisions. It's in black and white. There's no thinking about it. Again, some of the highlights of that: immigration. Congress is the one that determines immigration. Bankruptcies. Congress is the one that determines bankruptcies. Patents. Bitcoin. Congress is the one that determines these things. And of course, ultimately, the question of war and peace. It's a congressional choice, not an executive one. But you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that if you follow the news, if you were an alien that came down and visited our planet and just had news media in the last 20 or 30 years. All you'd see is the president, the president, the president, the president. And most people who live here, who are members of our society, they think and they reflect that same misperception. And this is the kicker. The next section of this article, the next section, is the implied powers. And basically, one can think of this as a loophole that covers everything. It's a loophole that you could drive a truck through. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into the execution of the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any other department or officer thereof. Okay? This is called the implied powers. So basically, whatever Congress wants to do, Congress can do it. Now, if you remember when we talked about the preamble, I suggested that this was the greatest document written by man. The Bible, the Quran, the Talmud, those are written by God. But it's not perfect. Because it was written by man, it is not perfect. And so we come now to this question of slavery. And we come to this idea that this document is not legitimate because the founding fathers could not solve this conundrum, because they could not solve this immorality of slavery. Well, and then the next section, we're going to talk about what were the attempts. What were the attempts to eliminate slavery, and how did the founding fathers fail to eliminate slavery, and that basically became the most costly war the United States ever fought, the Civil War. So in 1789, slavery was economically failing. You had people like Washington openly concerned about the expense of slavery. And you had this idea of what happened in the North was that slavery died out. So the economic theories behind the next section that we're going to read about, basically the founding fathers debated and thought about this idea of the importation if I import a good, right? If I have a good that's imported, and I cut off that importation, right? What's going to happen to the price? Well, again, the price will go up if people want that good. I don't want to get into the elasticity or inelasticity of a good, but so the supply will go down, right? And the price will go up. And so because slavery was dying in the North, or had died in the North, was not economically viable in the North, the founding fathers thought that, oh, this is going to, if as long as we stop the importation of the slaves, ultimately the people who are slaves today will die out. Well, again, we have a problem of unintended consequences. So what happened was you had the imposition of a law that stopped the importation of slaves. And so how do you make a slave? By rape. And so you had this incredible evil practice because of this next section, section 9. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such an importation not exceeding $10 for each person. So again, let me remind you, in 1787, the founding fathers are figuring by 1808, in the next generation, hopefully the slaves will be died out. The practice will become non-effective and will go away, will be abolished, but by natural attrition, not by law. Well, then what happened? Historically, you had, again, going into our previous sections of the Constitution of patents and trademarks, historically, you have Eli Whitney and the invention of the cotton gin or the cotton engine. And basically what the cotton gin is a bunch of saws. Now, one of the reasons why slavery was dying out in the late 1700s, one of the reasons what concerned Washington was a slave would take, again, if you're in California and if you've driven up the 5 freeway, you see cotton plants. And a cotton plant is a stick, but it has a fuzz on it and with the seeds. And that fuzz or lint is what's economically important in cotton. Cotton has two traits. One, it really sucks the nutrients out of the soil. And the second is that it takes a human being many hours to get a usable size quantity of lint. Well, the cotton gin was sort of like a tree chipper, and you stuck those plants, or you stuck that element of the plant inside the box, and you turn these saws, and out came the lint through filters and saws. And if you look at old pictures from the Civil War, you see these huge bales of cotton, right? These huge barges full of these bales of cotton. Well, this is what changed the economic viability of slavery, was the cotton engine. And all of a sudden, you have this ideological version of cotton is king, right? King cotton. That the South believed that they could become sovereign and they could perpetuate slavery based on the economic viability of cotton. That was a failure. And that's why when we talk about the Constitution, we do not use the divine, is because this is not a perfect document. And as other authors have said, slavery was a serpent coiled on the feet of the founding fathers. And again, we don't make excuses, and we don't gloss over this political and historical failure of the formation of our country and the formation of the political structure of the country. But we do want to remind people that ultimately slavery was defeated due to the Civil War. And ultimately, we have a civil rights movement due to the rule of law. And we'll talk about that later in the course. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion of the public safety may require it. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law. Ex post facto means after the fact. Shall be passed. No capitation or the direct tax shall be laid unless the proportion to the census and enumeration thereof before directed to be taken. This phrase in the Constitution has been amended. Many fraudulent people who say the income tax is not legitimate are wrong. The income tax the Constitution was amended to allow the income tax, and we'll read that later. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in the consequence of the appropriations made by law, and a regular statement on the account and receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. If you want to know how the government spends its money, there are records. There are things that you can look up. And so if you think that there's Area 51 aliens that are being housed on the government dime, you can look it up. You can see if it's true or not. And any other aspect of the budget or government spending that you want to investigate, there are records, and the records are made public. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign states. Now, this does not mean that Americans are discounting earned titles. If you have a title that you've earned through education, if you've had a title that you've earned through your own accomplishment, congratulations. What does this mean? This means that the Founding Fathers and the Constitution wants to have a meritocracy. We are judging you by you, not what your folks do, not what your parents do, not if your parents are incredibly wealthy, incredibly talented, incredibly accomplished, congratulations. We're not judging you by them, we're judging you on what you do. This is, again, we want a society based on merit. And you can see these elements, right? You can see that patents and trademarks, right? No titles of nobility. What do titles of nobility, usually what are they associated with? It's not just you can go around calling yourself the Duke of Orange County or the Count of Los Angeles County. No, they usually come with land. They usually come with some economic element. And what the Founding Fathers did not want to have is inherited wealth through these use of nobility. They did not want to have a permanent parasitic class of people who only survived and existed because of how they were born. And when you read the biographies of the Founding Fathers, it's very interesting. People like Franklin, Washington, Hamilton, their greatest ambition was to become a gentleman in the sense of a British gentleman, an English gentleman. And so you have Franklin, who's the inventor, like I said previously, of a lot of different inventions, who was a doctor of science because of those inventions, goes to England, and the British basically tell him, you'll never be a gentleman because you were born in the United States. You have Washington, who is an early officer in the British Guards. All he wants is, his biggest ambition is to become a regular in the British forces, and is told you cannot be one because of how you were born. The Founding Fathers, as products of the Enlightenment, basically said you should be judged by your own accomplishments. You should be judged by what you do, not how you were born. Now, some of us were born luckily. We had parents who taught us. Great. And that is manifested in an advantage. Of course it is. But what we're talking about and what our society is trying to deal with in the constitutional language that we've read is the individual should be judged by their own accomplishments. And that's why we don't allow titles of nobility. Section 10. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque or reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold or silver coin a tender of payments of debt, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or impairing the obligations of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. What that section is basically saying is state governments must have a balanced budget, and you cannot be the California Duke of King County, right? There's no titles of nobility. You have to basically conform to federal standards. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports except what may be absolutely necessary for the executing of the inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state or imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. Now, Orange Coast College is located by the Long Beach port, one of the major ports of the world, and LA County, Long Beach, only get revenues for administering the port. All the other duties and expos, the tariffs from China, etc., they go to the Treasury of the United States. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. So that is the first article. And as you see, the Congress has a lot of power. Unlike the political pundits that we listen to, unlike the political reporters that we listen to, it is Congress that is really the anchor of our political structure. And we also know that Congress and the Founding Fathers, by their language, wanted our society to be one of merit, that you risk things, and if you succeeded, your life would be better than if you failed. And we see the protection of property. So again, all of these modern era challenges that we face, immigration, Bitcoin, public health, issues of war and peace, all of these elements, all of these issues, we should be looking to Congress. We should be looking to our member of our House of Representatives or our senator. That's what we should be looking to. Instead, what do we look at? We are looking at the executive. We are looking at the president. Does the president chew gum? Does the president tie his shoes? What's the president doing? This is an element of the modern presidency from Teddy Roosevelt on, but also it is a lack of understanding of our political structure. And that's one of the obligations, or one of my missions or objectives of this course, is to show you that your politics are your own business, but the structure and where these decisions are made, that is written in the Constitution, and it's open for anyone to find. All you need to do is read it. Next time, we'll go to Article 2, and we'll talk about the presidency. We'll talk about the executive branch. And when you compare the executive branch and the elements of that structure and the implied and expressed powers that the Constitution gives Congress, you will see that it is a great difference. And one can wonder why we tend to look at the president instead of Congress. Thank you for joining me.